3:20 in the afternoon, this past Wednesday. A magnitude 4.1 earthquake rips through a stretch of rugged, empty mountains northwest of Covelo, California. People in Eureka feel it. People in Garberville feel it. People more than 100 miles away feel their houses move. 59 seconds later, before most people even had time to stand up in a doorway. Mutskudas. The ground breaks again. This time it's a magnitude 4.5. Same fault. Same patch of earth. 2 ruptures, back to back, less than a minute apart. And here's the part that should actually get your attention. That wasn't a random earthquake in a random place. That was the Bartlett Springs Fault, a fault most Californians have never heard of, doing something it's done 3 separate times now in the last 6 weeks. This morning, today, while I'm putting this together, it happened again. A smaller one this time, magnitude 3.4, same stretch of ground. The sequence has not stopped. So tonight I want to actually walk you through what's happening under Mendocino, Trinity, and Humboldt counties right now, or why seismologists are watching this specific fault more closely than they have in years, and why. And I promise this isn't clickbait. There's a 100-year-old dam sitting almost directly on top of it that a PG&E engineer has reportedly described as the thing that keeps him up at night. All right, hey everybody. If you're new here, get subscribed, notifications on. I track sequences like this in near real time, and this one is still moving. If you've been here a while, thanks for coming back. Let's get into it. I want to build this chronologically, because the shape of this sequence over time is genuinely more informative than any single earthquake in it. It starts back on June 24th with a magnitude 5.6 earthquake north of Redwood Valley. That one's associated with the Maacama Fault, which is Bartlett Springs' neighbor and running mate, a parallel strand of the same San Andreas fault system a bit further west. I mention it because it's the first domino. And because these 2 faults sit close enough together that seismologists watch activity on one when the other starts moving. Then, July 3rd, a magnitude 3.9 near Alder Springs, northeast of Covelo. Quiet, minor, easy to miss. Then July 10th, and this is where it starts to look like a pattern instead of noise. At 3:05 in the afternoon, a magnitude 3.8 strikes about 7 miles north of Covelo. 28 minutes later, a 2.7. Then, at 6:14 that evening, a magnitude 4.2, later revised to 4.4, in the same tight cluster, the largest of the 3. All shallow, all within a few miles of each other, all felt clearly on the ground in Round Valley. This is the earthquake the USGS flagged in its own system notes as, quote, the potential main shock of an earthquake sequence, meaning their own algorithms recognized this wasn't a one-off. That's the swarm I actually made a video about a month ago. If you watched that one, you already know this fault had scientists' attention before this week ever happened. Then it went quiet again for 3.5 weeks, which, in hindsight, is exactly the kind of pause that makes what happened next land harder. Tuesday, August 4th, 5:25 in the evening, a magnitude 4.0, sometimes logged as 4.1, about 19 miles northwest of Covelo, up near the Trinity-Humboldt-Mendocino county line, close to a place called Island Mountain. USGS Shake Alert activated for this one. I'll explain exactly what that means in a minute. Felt in Eureka, Rio Dell, Garberville, Alder Point. Then Wednesday, August 5th, the one I opened with. 3:20:58 in the afternoon, magnitude 4.1, 7.5 kilometers deep. 59 seconds later, 3:21:57, magnitude 4.5. This one even shallower, 4.5 kilometers down. Same location as Tuesday's quake, roughly 18 miles northwest of the July 10th cluster. The Redwood Coast Tsunami Work Group, which tracks this stretch of coastline closely, reported that the larger of the 2 was felt from Colusa, out in the Sacramento Valley, all the way to Arcata on the coast. That's a footprint over 150 miles across, from one magnitude 4.5. And then this morning, today, August 8th, a magnitude 3.4 in the same general footprint, 8 kilometers deep, still going. As of right now, there is no indication this sequence has finished. Let me orient you geographically, because this is genuinely remote country. Covelo sits in Round Valley, home to the Round Valley Indian Reservation, in northern Mendocino County, about 65 miles north of Ukiah, if that helps you place it. This entire sequence has been happening in the mountains to the north and northwest of that community, right along the mapped trace of the Bartlett Springs Fault, in terrain so rugged and sparsely populated that a lot of these epicenters are closer to old mining sites like Island Mountain than to any town at all. That remoteness matters for 2 reasons. First, the good one. This is a low population corridor, which is a huge part of why none of these quakes so far have caused injuries or reported damage. Second, the more complicated one, it's also why this fault has historically been under-monitored and understudied compared to something like the Hayward Fault running through downtown Berkeley, or the San Andreas itself. Fewer people means fewer instruments, fewer felt reports, and a shallower well of historical data for scientists to draw from. This is also Eel River country. The upper Eel winds through this exact stretch of mountains and the communities scattered along it. Covelo itself, Alder Point, Garberville further downstream, Xenia and Kettenpom back in the Trinity County hills, tend to be small, spread out, and a genuine drive from the nearest hospital or fire station. That's worth keeping in mind as we go because it means the margin for error here is thinner than it would be in a denser part of the state. A moderate earthquake that would be a non-event in the middle of Sacramento can knock out a single access road or a single power line, serving an entire community out here. And there isn't a backup route sitting right behind it. So let's actually talk about this fault because I think most people watching this have genuinely never heard of it before this week, and that's kind of the point. The Bartlett Springs Fault is a right lateral strike slip fault, meaning the ground on either side of it grinds horizontally past each other rather than up and down, and it's part of the same overall system as the San Andreas Fault. Specifically, it's the northward continuation of a branch that splits off the main San Andreas system south of San Francisco Bay, and geologists consider it the easternmost active strand of that whole system in Northern California. It runs for roughly 100 miles, starting up near the Round Valley Indian Reservation, where this week's activity is centered, running south through Lake Pillsbury, cutting through the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, and ending east of Clear Lake, where it steps over into a chain of related faults, Hunting Creek, Berryessa, Green Valley, that eventually link this whole system down toward the Bay Area. Here's a comparison that I think actually makes this click. The San Andreas Fault itself is creeping and slipping at roughly 2 inches a year in places. The Bartlett Springs Fault moves at something like 1/4 of an inch a year based on older estimates. Recent USGS geodetic modeling puts the loading rate closer to 7.5 millimeters a year, so call it 1/3 of an inch. It's the little sibling. But, and this is the important part, little sibling doesn't mean harmless. Multiple independent studies, including modeling published in 2015, put this fault's maximum earthquake potential somewhere between magnitude 6.3 and magnitude 7.2. That's not a typo. A 100-mile fault most people have never heard of is considered capable of producing a Loma Prieta-sized earthquake, or bigger. And here's the historical wrinkle that I think explains a lot of why scientists are paying closer attention now than they might have 20 years ago. The Bartlett Springs Fault wasn't even formally recognized as a regionally significant seismic source until the 1980s. It's been quietly there this whole time, underneath a stretch of California with less than 70,000 people living along its length, generating almost no public attention, right up until it started producing multiple magnitude 4+ earthquakes in 6 weeks. I titled this video Nervous Again on purpose, and I want to explain exactly what that means, because I think it's the most important framing device for understanding this week. This is not this fault's first attention-grabbing moment, even in recent memory. Back in 2016, a magnitude 5.1 struck near Lake Pillsbury. At the time, the strongest earthquake on this specific fault in more than 50 years, and it was felt from the coast at Point Arena all the way to Chico and Oroville in the Sierra foothills. That was treated, correctly, as a genuinely rare event for this fault. Then, this year happened. The June 5-6 near Redwood Valley on the neighboring Maacama Fault. The July 10th, cluster that USGS's own systems flagged as a likely sequence main shock. And now, 3.5 weeks later, a doublet that's actually larger than July's main shock, followed by continued activity into today. We are watching what looks like an unusually active year for this entire fault corridor, not just one isolated swarm. This is the part where I want to slow down, because I think a lot of coverage of earthquake swarms either oversells the danger or completely skips the mechanics. I'd rather you actually understand what these numbers mean. First, swarm versus sequence versus aftershocks. When most people think earthquake, they picture one big main shock followed by a fading tail of smaller aftershocks. That's the classic pattern, and it's mathematically well understood. A swarm is different. It's a cluster of similarly sized earthquakes without one dominant main shock towering over the rest. It can be driven by things like fluid movement underground or slow, aseismic slip on the fault rather than a single sudden rupture. What we've watched over the past 6 weeks, 3 separate clusters, none of them dramatically larger than the others, spread out geographically along the same fault trace, has real swarm characteristics, and swarms are genuinely harder for scientists to forecast using the standard aftershock models precisely because there's no single main shock to anchor the statistics to. Second, foreshock probability, and I want to give you the real number instead of a vague reassurance. As a general rule, across all of California, about 5 to 10% of earthquakes are followed by a larger earthquake nearby within a week. For context, when USGS ran the numbers on July's magnitude 4.4 event specifically, Their forecast put the 1-week chance of a magnitude 5 or larger aftershock at under 1%, with about a 2% chance of another magnitude 3 or larger event. Small, real numbers, not zero, not alarming, just honestly uncertain. That's genuinely how this works. Nobody, not USGS, not any university lab, can tell you whether Wednesday's magnitude 4.5 was the big one's opening act, or simply the largest earthquake this particular swarm produces. What they can do is watch the pattern and update the odds as new data comes in. It's also worth knowing how those odds actually get calculated, because it's not guesswork. USGS runs statistical models, built off decades of observed aftershock sequences all over California, that take the size of the triggering earthquake and the rate of activity that follows it, and use that to build a probability curve for what comes next. As more real data rolls in from a specific sequence, the forecast gets updated and retuned to that sequence specifically, rather than just relying on the statewide average. That's exactly why the number I quoted you for July's main shock was a live, sequence-specific forecast, and not just a generic California statistic. The trade-off is that these models were built primarily on a more typical main shock aftershock sequences, and they tend to perform worse on true swarms, like the one we may be watching here, because a swarm doesn't hand the model one clean triggering event to build the curve around. Third, shake alert. You saw me mention this system activated for Tuesday's earthquake, and it's worth understanding because it's one of the genuine success stories in this whole story. Shake alert is USGS's earthquake early warning system for the West Coast. It doesn't predict earthquakes before they happen, but it can detect the very first, fastest traveling seismic waves the instant alarm. Quake starts and push out an alert to phones and infrastructure in the seconds before the stronger shaking waves arrive. Seconds don't sound like much, but it's enough time to stop a train, pause a surgery, or just get your hands over your head. If you live anywhere in California, Oregon, or Washington, download the MyShake app. It's free, and it's the same alert system. Fourth, why these shallow quakes feel so much stronger than their magnitude suggests. Both of Wednesday's earthquakes were extremely shallow, 4.5 and 7.8 kilometers down, roughly 3 to 5 miles. Compare that to a lot of deep subduction zone earthquakes that happen 30, 40, even 60 miles down. The shallower the rupture, the less rock and distance there is to absorb the energy before it reaches the surface, so a shallow magnitude 4.5 can rattle a much wider area and feel considerably more violent than a deeper earthquake of the same size. That's a big part of why Wednesday's quake was felt from Colusa to Arcata. And fifth, the part that's actually the most scientifically interesting to me, fault creep. Recent USGS research, using gravity and magnetic surveys to map a mineral called serpentinite along the fault at depth, suggests the Bartlett Springs Fault may be creeping, meaning slowly and continuously slipping without producing large earthquakes more extensively at depth than older models assumed. Creep is generally considered a release valve. A fault section that's creeping is bleeding off strain gradually instead of locking up and storing it for a single sudden rupture. But here's the honest caveat, straight from the researchers themselves. Existing geodetic models of this fault are inconsistent with each other. Scientists don't yet agree on how much of this fault is creeping versus locked, which means nobody can currently tell you with confidence how much stress is actually built up and ready to release versus how much is quietly leaking out on its own. That uncertainty, as much as any single earthquake, is exactly why this fault keeps ending up back in front of researchers. I want to give this its own section because I think it's just as important as the earthquake numbers, and it usually gets buried at the bottom of coverage like this if it gets mentioned at all. About halfway down the Bartlett Springs Fault, roughly a mile from where this week's earthquake struck, if you follow the fault trace south, the fault runs almost directly beneath Lake Pillsbury, a reservoir held back by a dam called Scott Dam. Scott Dam is more than 100 years old, built in the early 1900s, decades before scientists even understood plate tectonics, let alone recognized that this specific fault existed. It wasn't formally identified as a serious seismic hazard until the 1980s, nearly 60 years after the dam was already standing. The engineering problems here aren't hypothetical. During construction, builders discovered the rock they'd planned to anchor the dam's southern end to wasn't bedrock at all. It was an enormous boulder that later shifted, forcing a redesign mid-build. There's an active landslide above that same southern abutment, estimated at over 8 million cubic feet of material. And PG&E's own 2016 safety review acknowledged that how that slope would behave in an earthquake simply hasn't been studied. And in 2023, PG&E's updated seismic risk assessment was serious enough that the utility preemptively lowered the dam's spillway gates and has kept them down ever since, cutting the reservoir's storage capacity by roughly 20,000 acre-feet, specifically to reduce the consequences if something goes wrong. A congressman who represents this district, has publicly recounted a PG&E engineer telling him of all the utilities infrastructure, Scott Dam is the one that keeps me up at night. PG&E has since moved to walk away from the dam entirely, filing paperwork with federal regulators to surrender the project's license and pursue decommissioning rather than keep operating it, a process that could take up to 2 years to resolve, and is currently caught in a real fight with local officials who worry about losing water storage in an already fire-prone region. I bring all of this up not to scare you about a dam failure that isn't imminent. Nothing about this week's earthquakes changes that timeline, and there's no indication Scott Dam is in acute danger right now. I bring it up because it's a genuinely useful illustration of why a swarm on an obscure fault matters beyond the immediate shaking. This isn't just an academic curiosity for seismologists. There is real, aging, load-bearing infrastructure, sitting close enough to this exact fault that the people who operate it have said, on the record, that it worries them more than anything else they run. I want to be straight with you about what would and wouldn't change this picture. A continued trickle of small earthquakes, even ones in the magnitude 3 and low 4 range, is honestly consistent with normal swarm behavior on a fault like this. Uncomfortable to live through if you're in Round Valley, but not by itself a sign anything is escalating. What scientists are actually watching for is a meaningful jump in magnitude, a shift in the depth or location of the cluster, or a change in the rate of events that breaks from the pattern we've seen since June. None of that has happened yet. I also want to be clear about what nobody can tell you, because I'd rather be honest than sensational. No scientist, no algorithm, no agency can currently predict whether this sequence produces a larger earthquake or simply fades out the way most swarms eventually do. What they can do, and what they are doing, is keep instruments running, keep updating aftershock forecasts as new data comes in, and keep asking anyone who feels shaking to file a report through USGS's Did You Feel It tool, which genuinely does help researchers map out how these earthquakes are actually experienced on the ground, block by block, in a way seismometers alone can't capture. If you live anywhere in this corridor, Mendocino, Trinity, Humboldt, Lake, or Glenn counties, here's what I'd actually do this week, not someday. Download My Shake so you get Shake Alert notifications with those precious extra seconds of warning. Do the boring stuff that actually saves lives in a real earthquake, and strap your water heater, secure heavy furniture and bookshelves that could tip, and know where the nearest solid cover is in every room you spend time in, so drop, cover, and hold on as muscle memory, instead of a decision you're making mid-shake. Put together a basic go bag, water, medications, a flashlight, a way to charge your phone, and actually talk with your household about where you'd meet if you got separated when a bigger one hit, because phone networks get overloaded fast after a real earthquake. If you're a homeowner, this is also a reasonable week to actually look into what your policy does and doesn't cover, since standard homeowners insurance in California does not cover earthquake damage. That's a separate policy through the California Earthquake Authority or a private carrier, and it's worth pricing out even if you decide not to buy it. If you're renting or you're out in a more isolated part of this corridor, it's worth knowing your evacuation route in 2 directions, not just one, given how easily a single slide or downed line can close the only road you'd normally take. And if you feel any of these, even a small one, take 30 seconds and file a Did You Feel It report. It's not just data for data's sake, it's genuinely one of the tools scientists are using to understand this specific fault better than they ever have, precisely because it's been so understudied for so long. Here's where I'll leave it. This is a genuinely active period for a fault system most of the country has never heard of, on the same footing as the San Andreas, but with a fraction of the monitoring and a fraction of the public attention sitting near infrastructure that the people who run it have openly worried about for years. Nothing about today's magnitude 3.4 tells us this is over, and nothing about it tells us something bigger is coming either. That's the honest, unsatisfying answer. And I'd rather give you that than a fake sense of certainty in either direction. I'm going to keep watching this sequence closely over the coming days. If USGS pushes out a formal updated aftershock forecast, or if anything in this pattern breaks from what we've seen since June, I'll have an update for you as soon as it happens. Until then, if you're in Round Valley, along the Eel River corridor, or anywhere near Kovlo tonight, you've had a real earthquake swarm sitting under your community for 6 weeks now. Take it seriously, get your basics squared away, and don't wait for a bigger one to decide it mattered. I'll see you in the next one.